Hi class, welcome to the recorded lecture for Chapter 3. As I mentioned in the first class, if you guys could give me some feedback and let me know whether or not you feel the pre-recorded lectures are helpful. If specific feedback as to what's helpful and what's not would actually be great. This chapter is going to start to talk about some of the elements of criminal law. One of them is actus reus, and you guys recall from Intro CJ, every criminal event in order to be a crime has to have a voluntary action, right? And that's the actus reus. So this chapter is going to talk a little bit about what exactly that entails. So we know that in order for something to be a crime, in order for somebody to be criminally responsible for something, there needs to be several elements. Not all crimes require all elements, and some crimes require additional elements and these are all written into the specific law. So we have the actus reus, which is the criminal act, mens rea, which is criminal intent. Concurrence is the idea that the criminal intent and the criminal act happen together. Okay, so the criminal intent has to trigger I have to intend to do harm to somebody, and that triggers my voluntary behavior. Sometimes there are attendant circumstances that are required, and usually we're looking for a bad result, right? Some type of harm that comes to somebody. So this chapter is going to focus mostly on criminal conduct, the actus reus. So in order to be criminally liable, there has to be some behavior that isn't justifiable, and it has to be triggered by that criminal intent. So this is sort of the bare minimum for a crime to happen. There are crimes that don't include a criminal intent or a bad result, but it's pretty rare for a crime to not require a criminal act. Usually crimes that don't require criminal intent then require some other type of circumstances to be present with that voluntary behavior. So for example, DUI, driving while intoxicated, or driving under the influence. Right, this requires an act, the actual driving, right, and the attendant circumstances is while intoxicated. So you don't have to intend to harm somebody when you're driving under the influence. Just the fact that you are driving under the influence is sufficient. If you could recall, I believe in Chapter 2 we talked about the corpus delicti, the body of the crime. This refers to the elements of the crime, right? So we need to be able to prove whatever elements are required. So crimes that do require a criminal act with criminal intent are called conduct crimes. And an example of this would be burglary. So burglary is breaking and entering a dwelling with the intent to commit a felony while inside. There's a couple of things to think about with burglary. You guys might remember some of these from intro. It doesn't have to be an actual theft, and you don't have to actually accomplish the felony while inside either. You just have to intend to do so. So the act of breaking and entering a house that's triggered by the intent to steal an iPod once inside. So the burglary is complete whether the theft occurs or not. You don't require any additional harm behind the criminal act. So the criminal act here is a voluntary bodily movement of breaking and entering someone's home. Serious crimes do require all of those elements to be present. We often call these bad result or result crimes. An example of this would be homicide. Right? So a homicide is a criminal homicide, is a criminal act triggered by the intent to kill which causes someone's death. So we've got the voluntary behavior there, right? And it's triggered by an intent to kill, so there's that mens rea, and it has to result in someone's death. So our first principle of liability is this actus reus, the criminal act. So all criminal behaviors have to be voluntary acts, right? We don't punish people for what they think. We don't punish people for who they are. We only punish people for what they actually do. So in order to be criminal, or in order to have criminality, attitudes have to actually turn into deeds, right? So we have to manifest that criminality, right? The behavior has to leave no doubt as to the criminal nature of the act. We often talk about someone being caught red-handed, right? This is sort of like catching the murderer with blood still on their hands. Voluntary act has several purposes, right? It helps us prove intent. We can look at someone's actions and from that infer what they intended to do, right? If they intended to harm somebody. So if I push you down the stairs and then I laugh and I say, ha, 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 you deserve that, I'm glad you're hurt, you can infer from my behavior that I intended to actually hurt you. The voluntary act reserves criminal law for cases of actual danger, and it protects individuals' privacy. So only voluntary acts can be crimes. A couple reasons for this. Right? Criminal law actually inflicts a punishment upon people. We can only punish people we can blame. We can only blame people who are responsible, and we are only responsible for our voluntary acts. So think about if I push you and you then bump into somebody as a result of that, and that pushes them out into the street in front of a car, are you responsible for that behavior, right? And if you're not, then we can't blame you. If we can't blame you, we can't punish you. Voluntary acts are usually defined by listing what acts are not voluntary. So things that are not voluntary include a reflex or a convulsion. If you were having a seizure and your body was moving and in that process you hit somebody, it's not a voluntary act. Any movement during your sleep or while you're unconscious, things that you do while you're under hypnosis. The Model Penal Code includes conduct which includes a voluntary act. So other acts surrounding the crime could be involuntary. And this is sometimes referred to as voluntarily induced involuntary action. Most states follow the MPC guideline, which says one voluntary act is enough. Okay, so the one voluntary act is enough is best illustrated by somebody who killed somebody in the course of a DUI. So somebody drinks too much, gets behind the wheel of a car, drives down the street, causes an accident in which somebody is injured or somebody dies. Did they intend to injure the person? Did they intend to kill them? No. But we still hold them criminally responsible because they did get into the car voluntarily after drinking. Okay? So that one voluntary act is enough. So here's some acts to think about. Would we consider them voluntary? What if you're driving, while you're driving, you fall asleep and you hit and kill someone? We just talked about drunk drivers. What about someone with very high blood pressure who suffers strokes while they're driving and they kill somebody because the stroke has incapacitated them? We're going to skip these couple of slides because I shouldn't have left them in here because we haven't gone over the cases yet. We will talk about those in class. So what about status, a status that you hold? Can that be considered a criminal act? So statuses denote who we are, right? So you are a student, you might be a parent, somebody could be an addict, you are a woman, you are a man, you are a brother, a sister, right? And most of these are not considered acts, right? But a status can result from voluntary action. So how does somebody become an addict? Well, first they have to voluntarily use drugs, right? Some conditions result from no action at all, right? And we're born with these characteristics. Your sex, your age, your race, your ethnicity, right? We don't do anything to make those things happen. So if some statuses can result from a voluntary act, would you hold somebody criminally accountable for them? So what about omissions? What about if we fail to do something? Is that a criminal act? We do have some laws that address this, right? So failure to act can be, or failure to report something. So for instance, if you work with children, you might be considered a mandated reporter, right? And that means that if you suspect abuse or neglect of that child, you are required by law to report it. If you fail to report it, you could be held criminally responsible. Depending on your job, you might have a duty to intervene to protect somebody. Other failure to act includes things like you have been convicted as a sex offender and you're told you have to register as an offender. If you fail to register, that is considered an act. For the most part, omissions are only criminal if there's a legal duty set up that requires you to act. And that will make a little bit more sense when we have a chance to discuss the cases in class. So legal duties can be created a couple of ways. You might have a law that says that you have a duty to act. So as I mentioned, the duty to report child abuse, to file your income taxes. You might sign a contract that requires you to act. So if you're a doctor in the emergency room, you can't just decide you're not going to treat someone who comes through the door. Police officers, firefighters, or a special relationship might do this. If you're a parent, you have certain duties towards your child. However, we can't hold somebody accountable because they fail to perform what we consider to be a moral duty. And your book is going to talk about the case of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese is a woman who called out for help several times. Nobody intervened, and as a result, she was stabbed to death. Most states don't impose a duty on us to render aid to somebody, okay? Good Samaritan doctrines create duties for a stranger to render aid. There are only a few states that do this. So for the most part, if you're walking down the street and you come across somebody who's lying in the street and they need help and they're screaming for help, you don't have any legal duty to do so. So for extra credit, let's look up whether or not Massachusetts has a Good Samaritan doctrine. Okay, and let's be specific that this is the type of Good Samaritan doctrine I'm looking for, because there are other Good Samaritan doctrines that have to do with drugs and alcohol, okay? Most other states follow the American bystander approach, so there's no legal duty to rescue somebody. So which does Massachusetts follow? Good Samaritan doctrine or American bystander? And if you guys can hold tight for a second, we'll get you a due date on that. I have to pull up your syllabus first. So let's go with February 5th by class time. What about possession? When you possess something, is that considered a criminal act? And probably the thing that comes to mind for most people is possession of drugs, but it could be possession of any type of contraband. So possession is not an act, it's a passive condition, right? And we use the law, we use a legal fiction to make that a voluntary act. We do this because we want to prevent worse crimes that could come about as a result of possessing something. And so most people obtain possession through a voluntary act. So in order to possess drugs, how would that happen? Normally you would have to voluntarily seek out and gain possession of those drugs. So this includes illegal weapons, drugs, drug paraphernalia, alcohol by minors. We can see we've got a full list of criminal possession statutes here, right? There's two types of possession. We've got actual possession, where you have actual physical control and the item is located on your person. It's in your purse, it's in your pant pocket. Constructive possession means you have the right to control the item, but it's not on your person. And this is probably the thing that a lot of people get in trouble for. Constructive possession could mean it's in your vicinity, it's on the table in front of you, it's in your room. These can take two forms, knowing possession and mere possession. Knowing possession is you're aware you have that on you or that you have control over it. And most states require possession to be knowing in order to hold somebody criminally responsible for that. In mere possession, the person is not aware that they have something on them or that they have control over it. So they don't know they have it or they don't know what it is. And only 2 states hold mere possession to be a criminal act. And this may have changed actually since the book was published, but what 2 states consider mere possession a criminal act? Okay, you have to give me both states in order to get extra credit, but that's worth 2 points. And let's also do that for February 5th. One thing to kind of think about: temporary and innocent possession of drugs by someone who confiscates them is a defense to prosecution for possession. Hopefully you guys have all read the material prior to listening to this lecture, so that it will make a little bit more sense. Definitely read it prior to our actual class meeting, so that in class we can actually talk about the cases. That's it.